Namaste and good morning, everyone. Let's do the prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhur Bhavaswaha, Tat Savitra Varenayam, Vargo Devasya Dhimahi, Diyo Yo Nah Prachodayat, Asto Ma Sadgamya, Tamso Ma Jyotirgamya, मृत्युर्मा अमृतं गम्य ओम सहनावतु सहनाभुनक्तु सवीर्यं कर्वावहे तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्वेषावहे ओम शांति 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 ओम. Let's open our Uddhava Gita books and we are going to start a new chapter today. In fact, there are only 2 chapters left. So chapter number 22 today. Jnana Yoga. That is the title of this chapter. Let me read the summary first. This chapter gives a summary of Jnana Yoga, which had been elaborately described in previous chapters. Everything within the cosmic manifestation is a product of the 3 modes of material nature. Although such products are perceived by the material senses, they are illusory by nature. Similarly, the conditioned soul's conceptions of good and bad that are given to such products and activities within the universe are illusory. It is better to avoid condemning or praising anyone because this confines one to the bodily concept of life and thus negates superior spiritual understanding. The spirit souls pervade the entire universe, and their nature is transcendental to mundane duality. By cultivating such an understanding, one can remain detached even while in material existence. As long as the conditioned soul desires the gratification of his material senses, the bodily conception of life will continue. Although material existence is illusory, like a dream, those attached to fruitive action remain entangled in the cycle of repeated birth and death. All conditions of material existence, such as birth, death, happiness, and distress, are experienced by the false ego and not the eternal soul. By distinguishing between matter and spirit, one can gradually renounce the false sense of bodily identification. While the material manifestation goes through stages of creation, maintenance, and annihilation, the changeless absolute truth remains undisturbed. While manifested, the universe rests in the absolute truth, which is all-pervading in time and space. The absolute truth is not transformed, but this cosmic manifestation is made possible by a transformation of the mode of passion. Passion is Rajsikta. By the mercy of a bona fide spiritual master, one can understand illusory nature of the material body and thus distinguish the absolute truth from such a temporary existence. When a person renounces all desires for sense enjoyment, he can become satisfied in the self alone. Just as the sun is undisturbed by the movement of clouds in the atmosphere, the liberated soul is unaffected by the activities of the material body. Still, when one is a neophyte in the practice of the devotional service of the Lord, one should carefully restrict his contact with the objects of the senses. Until one's determination becomes fixed, one may fall down as a result of obstacles placed before him on the path of spiritual advancement. Still, there is no loss for one who is engaged in devotional service because in his next life, he will be given a chance to continue his spiritual practice from where he left off. When one is actually liberated from material existence, he will never desire to indulge in insignificant material sense pleasures, knowing that his eternal self is distinct from the illusory material body. While one is on the path of spiritual realization, if one suffers from disease or other disturbance, he should not neglect to take proper remedial measures. The best means for lust and the other enemies of the mind is meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, especially by the performance of congregational chanting of the Lord's holy names. The false ego can best be conquered by rendering selfless service to the pure devotees of the Lord. By the practice of yoga, materialistic men hope to keep their body fit for sense gratification up to the limit of the attainment of mystic powers and an extended duration of life. These achievements have no lasting value, however, because they are in relation to the material body, which is temporary. The devotees of the Lord are therefore uninterested in attaining the mystic perfections of yoga. Instead, they are keen to take shelter at the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, knowing this to be the cause of the eternal cessation of material miseries and engagement in every blissful devotional service. So, beautiful summary of this chapter. So, now Lord Krishna is saying in the verse number 1, पर स्वभाव कर्माणि न प्रशंसेन न गृह्येत विश्वम एकामकम पश्यन प्रकृत्याः पुरुषेण च. The Supreme Lord said, one should neither praise nor criticize the nature and the activities of others. Rather, one should understand the material world to be working as a combination of material nature and the conditioned souls and resting in the absolute truth. After describing different philosophical systems, Lord Krishna now discusses the philosophy of impersonalism, which preaches that material creation is false. What is this material creation? Is it factual or is it false? Does it exist or is it merely an illusion? The answer to all these questions will be given in this chapter. Impersonal philosophers are divided into two categories: Vivratvad and Parinamvad. The Supreme Lord is both the cause and effect of this universe. If the theory that the absolute truth transforms to become the material universe, Parinamvad, is accepted, then it would appear that the Supreme Lord is changeable. On the other hand, those who propagate the philosophy of Vivratvad say that the absolute truth is unchangeable and that this material world is false. According to another opinion, since the material nature is the energy of the absolute truth, even if it is accepted that the material energy is subject to transformation, the absolute truth, being transcendental to material nature, remains unchanged. There is no objection if the followers of Parinamvad accept this opinion. Indeed, this is what has been described by the Supreme Lord, who says that he is the ingredient cause of this universe, the supersoul, and time. Although there is certainly a distinction between the energetic and the energy, the Supreme Lord, despite manifesting innumerable forms, remains one without a second. Of the two categories of impersonalists, the Supreme Lord approves the second category. In this chapter, the Lord describes the understanding of Vivratvad and Parinamvad. The word asat is used by the followers of the Vivratvad to mean illusion, but it is used by the followers of Parinamvad to mean temporary existence. The Vivratvadis say that all activities are false, whereas the Parinamvadis say they are temporary. This is the subtle difference between the two groups of impersonalists. In material existence, we create distinctions between one another due to bodily designations, sometimes praising and sometimes showing disdain. Those who are trying to situate themselves on the transcendental platform, however, should not indulge in such praises and criticisms. Knowing that the distinctions between the conditioned souls are simply a creation of the interaction of the three modes of material nature. Those who are impersonalists try to nullify the distinction between the seer, the seen, and the act of seeing, considering the absolute truth to be without variegatedness. In this material world, all varieties are manifestations of the interaction of the three modes of material nature. But in the transcendental abode of the Lord, Vaikuntha, there is no existence of the modes of nature. There, the Lord's spiritual energies have manifested a world of spiritual variegatedness. Because of the competition of the three modes of material nature, the polluted distinctions between superiority and inferiority predominate. Therefore, the material atmosphere is permeated with praise and condemnation. But in the transcendental abode of Vaikuntha, where there is no influence of the material energy, there are no such distinctions. So, transcendental itself means that you have transcended the nature, the material nature. So, of course, there's no sattvikta, rajsikta, tamsikta, it's only the absolute truth. Verse number 2. Par swabhav karmaniya prashasati nindati sa ashu bhrashyate swarthat asatya abhiniveshatah. One who indulges in praising or criticizing others' natures and activities will deviate from his own best interest because of his absorption on the platform of duality. One who glorifies or criticizes others' natures and activities remains absorbed on the temporary, material platform and thus becomes forgetful of the eternal spiritual reality. One who becomes habituated to finding faults with others instead of chanting the glories of Lord Hari in the association of devotees will surely exhibit great pride in himself while belittling others. The act of praising and criticizing others falls within the jurisdiction of the interaction of the three modes of material nature. The conditioned souls, being absorbed in duality, have brought about their condition of inauspiciousness. When one pursues his actual self-interest, which is to elevate one to the spiritual platform, he avoids thinking of others in terms of material designations and thus refrains from criticizing or praising others. The activities of this material world are temporary, full of ignorance, and produce misery, and can never be considered constitutional in nature. As long as one maintains the habit of criticizing or praising others in the bodily conception of life, he will never be elevated to the spiritual platform, having deviated from his real self-interest. Verse number 3. Lord Krishna is still speaking. तेज से निद्यापन्ने पिंडस्थो नष्ट चेतना मायाम प्राप्नोति मृत्युम Va tadvan nanarth drikpuman. Just as one loses external consciousness when his senses, which are born of the Rajasic Ahankara, are overcome by the illusion of dreaming, or death-like state of deep sleep, so a person absorbed in material duality must experience illusion and death. He who thinks in terms of material duality and thus glorifies or condemns others' nature and activities is deviated from his real self-interest. This verse provides an example to illustrate this point. The senses are produced from false ego in the mode of passion. When the senses are dormant, as the living entity sleeps, his mind is plunged into the illusion of dreaming. And when the mind becomes inactive, the living entity loses all external consciousness and remains in a death like state of deep sleep. Similarly, one who discriminates according to material designations covers his original consciousness, becoming almost like inert matter. Being enthusiastically engaged on the bodily platform, the conditioned souls remain indifferent to the service of the Lord as they continue dreaming of themselves as lords of the material nature. Such material absorption is the result of forgetting one's constitutional position as the eternal part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. Although materialistic sense enjoyers endeavor for achieving high positions within this world, they ultimately meet with the destruction under the control of the laws of nature. Being bewildered by false ego, although the conditioned souls are struggling hard for existence, while failing to worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead, they become very proud of their temporary designations, thinking themselves to be the lords of all they survey. Verse number 4. Kim bhadram, kim abhadram, na dvetasya vastunaha kriyat, vachoditam tad anritam manasadhyatam evacha. That which the conditioned souls express by their words or meditate upon by their mind is not ultimate truth. Considering this, what is actually good or bad within this illusory world of duality? In these verses, the Lord elaborately describes how it is foolish to glorify or criticize material conditions because anything seen as not related to the Supreme Lord is an illusion. The holy names, forms, abode, and devotees of the Supreme Lord are all transcendental and thus as good as Him. All dualities of this world, whether spoken by material words or meditated upon by the material mind, are illusory. The word asat means that which has no factual existence. So, praise and criticism of objects that are seen to be separate from the Supreme Lord is itself an activity of illusion. On the other hand, anything seen in relation to the Supreme Lord is to be considered transcendental. The Supreme Lord is eternal, full of knowledge, unlimited, and full of bliss. He is the reservoir of all transcendental pleasure. He has many transcendental names, such as Gopal, and these names are fully spiritual. Those who glorify the Supreme Lord are on the path to liberation, even before the devotee relinquishes his material body. He is awarded a spiritual body by the mercy of the Lord. The abode of the Lord is transcendental, and his associates are all transcendental. Anything that is not in relation to the Lord is mundane, illusory, and fit to be rejected. The absolute truth is reflected in the objects manifested by material nature. However, one should know that a mere shadow or reflection of the absolute truth, as found in material objects, cannot bring about genuine auspiciousness. Sometimes the mind accepts something as favorable, sometimes it accepts the same thing as unfavorable. Perverted existence cannot be accepted as ultimate reality, although it may appear similar. All actions performed in the perverted reflection of material existence, such as speaking and meditating, are self centered in nature, being nourished by the false ego. Those who are absorbed in thought of temporary material objects, those who take pleasure in discussing the temporary manifestations of the matter, are averse to the service of the absolute personality of Godhead, although they pose as being very expert in discriminating between that which is seemingly good and that which is apparently bad. When the eternal constitutional activities of the spirit soul are thus dormant, the mind assumes the role as a master. The mind's false ego considers itself as the enjoyer and thus becomes subjected to happiness and distress while interacting with the sense objects of form, taste, smell, touch, and sound with the help of the senses. When such sense enjoyers experience frustration, they imagine themselves as renouncing sense gratification while remaining engaged in propagating the philosophy of impersonalism. While such people remain deviated from the path of devotional service because of their materialistic mentality, they attribute mundane abomination to the supreme absolute truth, having no understanding of the spiritual energies. Haladini, Sandhini, and Samvit. Being impersonalists, they consider the temporary material manifestations as false and the eternal kingdom of God as a similar mundane existence. Those who are conversant with the truth know that it is unreasonable to equate this temporary cosmic manifestation with the eternal abode of the Lord. Verse number 5. Chaya pratyadhyabhas hi asanto api arthkarina evam deh adyo bhava yachantya amrityo bhayam. Although shadows, echoes, and the acceptance of a seashell as silver are only illusory reflections of real things. Such reflections do cause meaningful perception. In the same way, although the identification of the conditioned soul with his material body and mind is illusory, this identification creates a fear within him right up to the time of death. If temporary material objects are not reality, then how can parts and pictures be of use? The answer is that just as a shadow, echo, reflection, or the acceptance of a seashell as silver produces an emotional response, although illusory, so material objects, although temporary and illusory, are still considered as useful by the conditioned soul. Although the material body is temporary and illusory, it creates a fear of material existence for the living entities up until the time of death. A reflection, shadow, and echo, and the mistake of accepting a seashell as silver are illusory existences. Although they resemble the objects they imitate, they are distinct from them. The living entity's conditioned state is a temporary and illusory manifestation of reality. Non devotees, being bereft of the service of the Lord's lotus feet, which award fearlessness, experience fear, illusion, lamentation, and so forth in relation to illusory material manifestations. Forgetfulness of one's constitutional position makes one identify with his gross and subtle bodies, which are temporary and thus subject to annihilation, causing great fear and anxiety. Verse number 6 and 7, they are together. Atamev tad idam vishwam srijyate srijati prabhu trayate trati vishwam riyate harti ishvaraha tasman nahi atmano nayasmad anyo bhavo nirupate yam trividha nirmul bhatir nirupata atmani idam gunmayam vidhi trividham maya kritam. The super soul is the supreme controller and creator of the world. And thus, he is also that which is created. Thus, the soul of all existence maintains and is also maintained, withdraws and is also withdrawn. No entity should be ascertained as being separate from him, the Supreme Soul, who nonetheless remains distinct from everything. When the truth has been ascertained in this manner, it should be understood that the three conditions of material existence, Adhyatmika, Adhidevika, and Adhibhutika, are illusory, being manifestations of Maya. The Vedas have ascertained that the material creation is a manifestation of the separated energy of the Supreme Lord. How then can it be considered false? The answer is given here. The Supreme Lord is both the cause and effect. Therefore, the material manifestation is not separate from him. He maintains the entire universe in his form as Paramatma. Nothing seen as without relationship with the super soul can be accepted as a reality. The three features of material existence, Adhyatmika, Adhidevika, and Adhibhotika, are thus manifestations of illusion. If the super soul is the actual form of the universe, then from where did these three features come? The answer is herein given. If there's no original, then how can there be an imitation? The cosmic manifestation is a creation of the inconceivable energy of the Lord. This is the doctrine of the followers of Parinamvad. The followers of Vivratvad say that these three features are illusions born of ignorance. The material world has emanated from the energy of the Supreme Lord. It is maintained by him for some time. Then it again merges within him. The temporary cosmic manifestation is meant for the inhabitation of those who are averse to the service of the Supreme Lord. The Lord divides the time factor and empowers the material energy, which possesses the power to cover the consciousness of the living entities and to throw them into the darkest region of nascence. The external energy which manifests the material world has no existence separate from the Supreme Lord, whose nature is eternal, full of knowledge and full of bliss. He is very dear to his devotees. The objects of the senses have been created for the enjoyment of those who have turned their backs on the Supreme Lord. The great variety of conditions that have manifested within material existence are designed to capture the conditioned souls whose only engagement is the gratification of their senses. The abominable conditions of birth, death, old age, and disease are absent in the eternal abode of the Lord, Vaikunt or Golok. Thus, there is a gulf of difference between the manifestations of the internal and external potencies. All the objects of the material world are products of the three modes of material nature, which are manifested from the external energy of the Lord. Just as an echo is similar to the original sound it mirrors, the activities of the material world bear some resemblance to those enacted in the eternal abode of the Lord. Materialistic people generally consider the form of the Lord to be a manifestation of the modes of material nature. And such a conception is a product of the darkness of nascence. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is pure, transcendental existence, devoid of all kinds of abomination that is experienced in the world. The Lord is unlimited and absolute. Verse number 8. एतत् विद्वान् मद उदितं ज्ञान विज्ञान नैपुणम न निदन्ति न च स्तौति लोके चरति सूर्यवत. One who has become firmly fixed in the understanding that I have imparted and its practical application will not be concerned with honor or dishonor. Like the sun, he wanders unimpeded throughout the world. After realizing this knowledge and its application, as instructed by the Supreme Lord, learned devotees treat everyone equally, like the sun, which distributes its heat and light to all without discrimination. The living entities are eternally parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, and thus they are by nature full of knowledge. However, involvement in mundane activities, which naturally involves praising and criticizing others, covers one's pure and original consciousness. Just as a devotee should not be attached to anything material, so he should also not be hateful of anything. He should simply accept everything favorable for the service of the Lord and reject everything that is unfavorable, as directed by the spiritual master. Verse number 9. Pratyakshena anumanena nigmena atma samvida adye antvad asaj gyatvaha nisangoho vicharet ihi. By means of sensual perception, reason and logic. Pratyaksh anuman, that's what he's telling us. By means of sensual perception, reason and logic, the evidence of the scriptures, and one's own understanding, one should know that this world has a beginning and an end, and thus has no ultimate reality. Keeping this always in mind, one should live in this world without attachment. This is the Gyan, how to live in this world. Anything that has a beginning also has an end. Through direct perception, one can see the beginning and end of the material objects, such as clay cooking pots. Through deduction, one can conclude that there is a beginning and an end to this visible world. From the Vedic statements, one can hear about the beginning and end of the material elements, such as the sky, and by means of the one's personal realization, one can understand that the cosmic manifestation is temporarily manifested by the Lord as a concession for the conditioned souls who desire material enjoyment. A self-realized soul can understand through direct perception, deduction, and the evidence of the transcendental sound vibration that this material world is always changing and has a beginning and an end. A realized soul could never accept this world as eternally existent and unchanging, knowing it to be a transformation of the absolute truth. Transformable nature is distinct from eternal nature. The Vedas inform us that the cosmic manifestation is a transformation of the Lord's illusory energy and therefore temporary. Only those who have cultivated spiritual knowledge, which is the fruit of their practice of yoga and meditation, can live in this world without attachment. Having realized its temporary nature by means of direct perception, deduction, and scriptural evidence. The word nisang, however, does not indicate that such a person gives up the association of devotees and the worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So far, Lord Krishna was speaking in this chapter, first 9 verses. Now Uddhav is talking. He says in the verse number 10, Nev Atmano Nadehasya Samsriti Drishtri Drishyo Anatma Ev Sva Drishor Ish Kasya Syad Uplabhyate. He says, My dear Lord, it cannot be that this material existence is the experience of either the soul, who is the seer, or the body, which is seen. On the one hand, the spirit soul is innately endowed with perfect knowledge. And on the other hand, the material body is not a conscious entity. To whom then does this experience of material existence pertain? The living entity is a pure spirit soul, full of knowledge and bliss, whereas the material body is a machine without consciousness. Who is what is actually experiencing the ignorance of material existence? The conscious experience of material life cannot be denied. And thus Uddhav asks Lord Krishna this question to elicit a more precise understanding of the process by which illusion occurs. Although this material creation is temporary, as long as it exists, who is it that experiences happiness and distress? The material body is a product of matter and therefore inert by nature, so that it cannot feel material happiness and distress. The spirit soul is by nature full of knowledge. Therefore, how could he lose such constitutional knowledge? How has the spirit soul been placed into illusion? Inert matter cannot see, and the soul, being fully spiritual, has nothing to do with matter. How then can these two have a relationship as the seer and the seen? So beautiful questions asked by Uddhava after listening to that complete knowledge, but still questions come. And in our Vedic way of learning and teaching, questions are always encouraged. By asking the questions and getting the right answers, we understand more. So we'll start with verse number 11 next week. And we'll see what else he's asking, because his questions are like this. One more verse with his question, then Lord Krishna is going to answer his questions. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaye Purnameva Viseshyate Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much.